Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 139, The State of CSS and Moving Forward in 2018. We are your hosts this week, Justin Burrow, Danny Blue, and Amal Hussein. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Justin.
Hola, hola.
Leon is on vacation.
What?
I feel like, yes,
How dare him? How dare him enjoy himself?
He did not remove himself from the beach to join us today. So before we introduce our guest and talk about the state of CSS, we're going to throw it over to Danny this week and talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Danny?
Thanks very much, Justin. So this week in the web, Angular 4.x has been released. One thing to be very sure of is there was a bug in 4.1, I think. So make sure you are up to date with the latest 4.4 release if you're doing that. I wanted to give a quick shout out to some work being done on another project called ng-packagr, which helps with packaging Angular modules for to be put on NPM or consumed by your other applications. We're using it at work and it's working great. As of Firefox 570A1 U2F is sitting behind a flag, which will hopefully land soon, with the ability to use. Is that YubiKeys, Justin?
Yes, YubiKeys indeed, yes.
YubiKeys, and the related security keys. Polymer 2.1.0 landed, which allows the setting of Polymer.passiveTouchGeastures to enable better scroll performance, which is great. Anybody that's ever had to deal with scroll performance will appreciate that. iOS 11 begins rolling out today, so that means new Safari, and we get new sets of fixes and features, including more standards-compliant flexbox, flags to enable experimental features, so WebRTC, media capture for real-time audio video, and some other stuff. Looking forward to. On the Apple front, there have been a few articles posted about the iPhone 10, the notch in the top of it, and there do seem to be some workarounds to make it so that it doesn't just cut a big chunk out of your application. So some people were a little bit worried about that. So it's good that we seem to have a way around it. And that is This Week in Web.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, interesting stuff. Yeah, I'm sorry, I put the UTF thing in there too because I'm a big fan of the FIDO Alliance stuff in terms of security and whatnot. So I've been waiting for that flag for a long time.
No, that's awesome. That's my fault for not reading all of them all the way through and realizing I have no idea what that is. This must be a Justin question or a Justin.
Oh yes, because I'm probably one of the few people who, well, I spend a lot of time with the truckers. I like tickets. I like reading about conversations and things. And today we're getting to have a really interesting conversation because we've got an amazing guest this week, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Erik Meyer. Erik, thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here.
So I don't know a lot of people who don't know you. You've been on the web for a very long time doing amazing things. But tell everyone a little bit about yourself for those out there in the world who don't know you.
Also, feel free to use the word legend like every other word when you do the introduction.
Okay. I will feel free to do that. I'm not sure that I will. Although I was once told that every biography should start with rocketed from the dying planet Krypton to Earth as an infant. Now,
that's gold.
Yeah, that's what someone told me once. I was like, what should I put in my bio? He's like, this is how you should start every bio. I go, okay. Anyway, so tell about myself. I've been doing the web thing for a really long time, like since 1993. And I stumbled into CSS at a very early point. And so through a somewhat fortuitous chain of events, I became kind of a CSS go-to expert type. Wrote O'Reilly's CSS The Definitive Guide, which is coming up on its 4th edition, or it's almost done. I think it's supposed to be published in October of this year. And I also had a very early hand in microformats, and I co-founded An Event Apart with Jeffrey Zeldman. It's a web design development UX conference series kind of thing. I don't know. I've done a bunch of things, and each one of them by itself is just kind of, yeah, that's nice. And then when I look at all of them together, I struggle to figure out where all the time came from sometimes. But especially the writing books takes a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, you've written a lot. You've been around the block in terms of things, the stages that the web has gone through as a whole. Because I really didn't get to the web until '96. And even then, like, I was 3 years late. Really, I was a wee bit late to that party. At that point, I was like, "Wow, this is amazing."
Yeah, well, the fact that I've been around the block a few times, I think, just indicates that I'm not yet mature enough to cross the street on my own.
Well, isn't that the entire thing with the web, Eric? It's just a constant. Are we actually crossing the street this time on this feature or this API? I feel like that's like 90% of the conversations that happen. Is that someone who lurks on the mailing list and goes, "I think I've read this conversation before. Should I point this out? I just can't do it." It's like I'm just like, no, it's a mailing list. Shh, quiet.
Yeah. Anyone who's been on the web long enough and participated in the various sort of discussions behind the curtain, which we're sort of talking about there. And I don't mean behind the curtain as in the W3C. I mean behind the curtain as compared to the rest of the world, right? The people who talk about APIs and HTML and semantics and all that kind of stuff. If you've spent long enough, the same conversations do come around. And I've had that question before. It's so we're going to argue about this again. Okay, that's the fourth time this decade. Should I tell them what happened the other three times or let them figure it out on their own?
It is interesting to me. Those conversations do pop up a lot. And I think that's, on the one hand, it's new people coming into the web and they're going, "Hey, this is the new thing and I've got the great idea." And then everyone else, the older people or the people who've been around are going, yes, we know.
Yeah,
we've talked about this.
It is a good idea. Here are the 17 reasons why it won't work. And I honestly, like personally, I actually hate to do that, right? Because someone's got this, they've got an idea, they're really fired up about it, and I could say, okay, here are all the reasons why that failed before, but why not let them try? Because maybe they'll come at it from some totally unexpected angle that no one ever thought of before, and it'll work this time.
I feel like that's the great thing about the web, honestly, is that there is that sense of collaboration around. I wonder if, because I know that's me in a nutshell. I'm like, someone will do it better than me. Someone will figure this out and solve problems that that I did not suggest or whatnot, or something that that was old becomes new again. You see a lot of that collaboration now, particularly with the I can never say the name, Wigig. Or the incubator group. Yeah, WCAG. Is that how we're saying it? I don't.
Well, are we talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or something else?
No, I was talking about the incubator group.
Oh,
where you see so many ideas come through the incubator group from developers who are sort of coming to the web, who haven't heard those other conversations. I love seeing that. Like, to me, that's like, yeah, come out, talk about stuff. There's the idea of idea exchange. I still like that, even if I've heard it 17 times before.
Yeah.
You just want everybody to grow as bitter as you, Justin.
I'm not super bitter. No. I'm just kind of like, hey, some days are worse than others. I mean, it happens. But I don't say anything because...
Yeah. Well, Eric, again, it's an absolute honor to have you here. And again, I think the conversation is echoing to the fact that web in general seems to kind of be the most humbling industry to be a part of. And it's also the industry that kind of also very often makes you feel like a beginner and a child again and again and again and again, and in Justin's case and in your case, and for people who have extensive experience, also kind of makes you feel bitter and grumpy because it's just these different conversations recycled, right? So
yeah, I mean, It is definitely a humbling field because it changes so often, and because when you think about it, like when you really think through what it is people are trying to do, when just the sheer act of trying to share information on the web, you are, I mean, people have said, I forget who it was that said that the web is the most hostile environment imaginable. I think it was Douglas Crockford said something like it's the most hostile engineering environment imaginable. And I actually disagree with that. It's the most hostile environment imaginable to assumptions, right? You assume that everyone has broadband, or you assume that everyone's using a desktop, or you assume that everyone's using mobile. And actually none of those things are true. And, it's not that everyone is using one browser. There's dozens or more if you go back far enough. And you can never really take anything for granted. Like, about the most you can take for granted is if that someone has HTTP ability and an HTML browser. That's it. And when I say HTML browser, I literally mean just HTML. They might have a browser that doesn't run JavaScript. Or it runs JavaScript like before it was called ECMAScript, when it was just called JavaScript, because that's how old their phone is, because that's all they have. Or, it might not deal with CSS, or it might not deal with CSS that's since 2006. Or there's just all of these factors that come into it. And I used to follow PC gaming years ago, and developers would complain about how many graphics cards they had to support, and the fact that like there would be some weird bespoke PC that somebody had cobbled together out of scavenged parts from a landfill, and they couldn't get their game to run on it, and so they would complain about that. As a web developer, we should be so lucky to have that limited a landscape to have to deal with. Honestly.
This comes up whenever I talk to people that specialize in mobile development. I have a really good friend, Cody. He's been doing Java and Android for a long time, and I always give him crap about the state of some of the Android stuff. Like, I think they're just getting the ability to monitor like network traffic and stuff like that. And then of course he gives me crap for just how many different things you have to test for when you're building something for the web.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are ways to mitigate the amount of difficulty that you might run into, and but there are some things you just can't avoid, right? Like if you start as simple as possible, like the simplest possible way of doing whatever it is you're trying to do, and then enhance it from there, you're in a better place. That's not a panacea. It's not going to solve every problem, but you're in a much better place, right? So if you are pushing out documentation, it should be HTML, right? And then you add CSS to make it look pretty, and you add JavaScript to make it more interactive. That's fine, right? But at base, it should be HTML, so that if somebody is trying to read your documentation and JavaScript isn't working for some reason, whatever the reason is, they can still read it. They might not get the enhancements that you layered onto it, the automatically built table of contents or whatever, but they're still getting the information. And Jeremy Keith, I don't know how familiar his name would be, but he's done a lot of stuff over the years, and he talks about this a lot. Like, just start with the simplest possible thing. Like, if you're building a Google Docs like thing, start with a text area and some sort of rendering, and then like go crazy making that cooler, but have that foundation, right? Like, build on a foundation. Don't cobble together a whole bunch of stuff with no foundation, which is what happens a lot. And when I say foundation, I do not mean necessarily Zerb foundation. Just to be clear.
I mean, oh my god, that's yeah. Yeah. So Erik, I mean, I think that's such an interesting point, because there's so many JavaScript frameworks that
Yep.
just without, right, there is no foundation. Everything is this dynamically rendered thing, and that takes a ton of processing power and JavaScript and this and that. And so I think that's a very solid principle, and I think it's actually a really good kind of tagline for why kind of extensible web and things like web components are cool and almost better, right? which kind of maybe nicely leads into our first question for you, which is that, CSS is this kind of very often overlooked part of building good web apps. And I know, these brilliant solutions engineers and software architects that, are doing complex distributed systems work, and then they shudder when they think of CSS. They're just too afraid to do it, and it behaves differently from browsers, et cetera. So what is the fear? Why is CSS, why does it have the rep that it has? It's a loaded question, but it's also so often overlooked when looking at the ecosystem.
Well, I think to some degree it comes back to that thing about the web being an incredibly hostile environment to assumptions, and people who are doing like distributed engineering, right? They're used to writing code that it works or it doesn't, and CSS isn't like that at all. It's not designed to be like that. It's designed to be much more robust, but that also means that you don't get these flags that tell you that something's wrong necessarily unless you happen to look at it in the right way, right? And this happens with people who write a lot of JavaScript too. People who come at it from a JavaScript perspective are used to, if something in my code is wrong, like the parser can't get it, an error is thrown and nothing happens, and I know that it's broken, right? And of course, if they're not testing it in a bunch of different clients, then they don't know where it might break. But let's just, take it back to JavaScript on the server side as an example, right? If it doesn't run on the server, then it throws an error. I figure out what the error is. I fix the error. Then the code runs a little further and it throws another error, and et cetera, right? But eventually you get code that runs. Whether or not it does anything useful is beside the point. It runs, and you know that. But with CSS and with HTML, but CSS gets a lot more of this. You don't know that, right? You can type in, border diagonal gray, and assuming that there will be some sort of diagonal border, right? That's not going to do anything. But there's no parser to like stop. There's nothing that says, oh, you have an error here. So you can misspell property names or value names. I mean, I literally once misspelled H1, which takes some talent. But the only way that I knew that I'd gotten that wrong was that I loaded up the page and the first level headings didn't look the way I expected them to. And I went back and forth for a while, right? And if you come from a mindset of, like, I have this code that compiles to something or it doesn't, then CSS is like alien and weird. And I get that. To me, because I've been working with the web for so long, HTML and CSS are very robust, right? And I'm used to the feature of the web that if a thing isn't recognized, the parser just throws that bit out and keeps going and can operate on the rest of it. So when I actually go to code that requires things to like everything to be correct, like JavaScript or PHP for that matter, any number of other languages, it's weird to me, and it's a little bit difficult for me because I'll be going through, it's like, oh, okay, so you're throwing an error there, but what about the rest of it? Like, tell me what happened to the rest of it. But nothing happened to the rest of it. I have to literally get every single thing exactly right before I can find out if my code did what I wanted it to. And it's weird sometimes for me. Like I write JavaScript. I'm not, huge expert at it. I'm probably, anyone who really knows what they're doing in JavaScript would look at my code and probably have a laugh, and that's fine. I don't have to be an expert in everything, but I just want you to draw a circle here. Why is nothing happening? All I have is blankness. And so there's that, because it's so flexible, right? And it's so, in that sense, it feels unpredictable to someone who's used to that predictability. And so of course they shudder a little bit. It's like, I could do things wrong and it will never tell me until I get like angry email from my boss or the users telling me that it's not working or it looks bad or whatever it is. And I think the other reason, to be clear, is that CSS for a presentation language has really lacked something very fundamental for a very long time, which is layout. CSS has been a presentation language, and it's had this huge layout-shaped hole right at the center of it, right? It's really great for sizing text and coloring text and setting up borders, but trying to lay anything out was Jen Simmons basically has this analogy, which I think is just about perfect. We laid out everything with floats because we had basically nothing else, which is like trying to build a mosaic out of soap floating in a bathtub. It's not a good idea. And yet, if literally all you have is a bathtub and different colored bars of soap and you need to make a mosaic, you work with what you got. But that's changing. And it's actually changing incredibly rapidly right now.
Yeah, so like floats were used for a very, very long time. Like I think about how long it took browsers to land flexbox, and we even just said earlier in the episode that iOS 11 is getting more spec compliant flexbox now. But now we get flexbox, and we're already not moving on, but we're now also getting like just a full CSS grid grid setup, which is awesome. But it does feel like the amount of time between floats and flexbox is much longer than between flexbox and grid.
That is, yes, absolutely, 100%.
So Erik, you called CSS a presentation language, and so I think, can you maybe elaborate a little more on that? Because I've always wondered, like, is CSS a programming language, or like what is it, right? So can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the role it plays?
Yeah, I mean, CSS is what makes things look the way they do, or at least suggests that things should look the way you want them to. Right. And that gets back to it again. The whole idea that if somebody is using links on a Unix system, they're not going to get any CSS. They're just going to get the text structured however you structured it in HTML. And that's, admittedly probably a rare case, but it does still happen. There are still people using feature phones, which is to say like the old flip phones that could consume HTML and HTTP, but they don't do anything with CSS. They don't do JavaScript. Things like that. So, CSS is a suggestion, right? It's, I think you should render these things this way. I think you should make, paragraphs have this font with this size in this color. And if the user agent, to use the technical term, can, it will. But if it can't in some way or another, then it will do what it can and leave out the rest. So, yeah, there's always this thing about, is CSS a real programming language? And a lot of that comes down to what you define as a programming language. I mean, you can do a lot with it. And you can do it in a remarkably human readable, expressible way. Right? It may not have the same level of capability that, let's say, Flash did in terms of like drawing rectangle here, drawing thing there, animating. I mean, you can make it all happen, but you don't necessarily have that same sort of environment. But if you ever looked at the actual like code of a Flash file, there was no, it wasn't human readable. There was no way to say, oh, this does this does that. Whereas with HTML, SVG, right, you can, not saying that everyone would want to, but you can go in there and figure out what all the pieces are. It's fairly human readable. And, with the property value combinations in CSS, right, you say color red or font size 200%. Like that's understandable. People can immediately get what that means, even if they don't necessarily see all the ramifications until they've gotten some experience. And I find that a really powerful way of doing things. And, CSS doesn't have conditionals the way that we typically think of them. It does have conditionals, but they're very limited in scope. Media queries are conditionals, but you can't use them to like do counting loops or whatever. But it's still if we're in this kind of environment, do this thing. Else, if we're in this other kind of environment, do this thing. There isn't really if else, but there's if. And feature queries, the @supports block is another conditional. Is if basically saying to a browser, if you support this thing, then do these styles. So you can say, if you support background clip padding box, then here are some styles that you should apply. And browsers that don't understand padding or background clip padding box will just not apply those styles. And browsers that don't understand what at supports is will skip over that whole block and they don't have to worry about it. So, there are things like programming, what we think of as programming in there, custom variables. Well, they're called custom properties, but they're essentially CSS variables. Those are starting to land now and getting widespread support. And there's what was the other thing? I just lost it. But these sorts of programming like things that we think of are starting to make their way in. And we have variables largely because of preprocessors. That's the deal. Because for ever since CSS started back in 1996, basically, people have been saying, "Can I have variables? I just want to say color 1 equals this, and then I can refer to color 1 throughout the whole style sheet." And basically, the answer from the working group was, well, if you really need that, then you can use a preprocessor. Even before preprocessors existed, really. And then preprocessors got popular, and everybody started using variables. And then those of us who were able to, to advocate for that would go back to the working group and say, "Hey, so it turns out variables are super popular. Maybe CSS should support that sort of thing natively." And now that after some time to figure out how they wanted to do that, it's coming. Preprocessors have actually led the way on a lot of things.
Well, it's interesting. The web platform as itself, I mean, if you look at query selector, for instance, on the JavaScript side, I mean, realistically, that kind of came out of the conversation around what jQuery was doing in terms of, hey, how do we get things out of the DOM? And I think it's interesting that tools sort of inform the way the web platform moves, and the flexibility of the platform to continuously render while things don't necessarily want to work, when the parser doesn't understand things, is one of the reasons we have the web we have today. Yep. And the spread of it. Because if you would have had something so strict as that we sort of recall from, well, even now, right? It's not like I can sit here and go, you know what, let me write some, malformed Java for Android or some Swift that's all funky for iOS. It's not going to do anything, right? It's just going to go, I'm not going to build this, right? Mm-hmm. To me, the web has been powered by the fact that, yeah, we know that all the code is not perfect, but by God, we're going to show you something. We are going to put, pixels on a screen. I don't care what kind of screen it is, by God. But
the browser is very determined.
Yes, the browser. We are a determined lot when it comes to rendering pixels.
It's the little engine that could. It really is.
Yeah, and I mean, imagine how many other systems can you think of that were designed with that fundamental principle?
Most of them are designed for the exact opposite.
Yeah,
actually.
Like Flash. Flash was. With Flash, it either worked or it didn't. And you either had the plugin or you didn't. It was very binary. See, that's the thing. The web prizes ubiquity over consistency. And almost all other systems are the other way around. They prize consistency over ubiquity. They would rather only work in limited ways as long as you're sure they'll always work the same way. The web is exactly the opposite. And I agree with you completely. It's one of the reasons why it got so far. People could put up stuff on GeoCities or Neopets, which is where a lot of people got started. And, maybe they wrote their HTML in a way that a trained computer scientist would curl up in a ball and sob. But like something happened, right? And that's that first impetus. Rather than the first thing you do being error, the first thing is, oh, that's not what I expected, but I can see my Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan page. Right?
Mine was an X-Files page, just in case anybody's wondering.
I'm sorry, it was a what?
Mine was an X-Files page. I had
an X-Files page.
Oh, you got to have an X-Files page in 1996, like that.
Yeah, see, I was 1993, so I had some Babylon 5 pages.
There you go. See, of course.
That's not actually what I started with, but I had them.
Yeah, if you didn't have a fan page, I feel like you missed out on a critical portion of the web.
Yeah, so actually,
that was important.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. And my first ever HTML document, when I was learning HTML, my first document was I went on Usenet, kids, ask your parents, and I got the Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode guide, which was just in raw text, and I marked it up. That was the first document I put together, and I published it December 1993.
Yeah, that's a solid first document.
I
like that.
It was huge. It was repetitive, and I had no tools to help me. That was when, if you wanted a web page, you had to write it in some sort of text editor and save it as plain text. So I literally wrote I marked up my first web document in Microsoft Word for the Mac I think it was Word 5, but it might have been the version before.
Wait,
and then save as text.
Was it WordPad or
No.
Word though? Because
Microsoft Word, like
Word.
yeah.
Okay.
And then had to make sure to save as text, because if I saved it as a Word document, nothing was going to work, right? And save as text, and then make sure it had a .html and load it up in a web browser. I was like, oh my god, this is working. And the markup was horrible, semantically speaking. Like, this was when I thought that the P tag was just two BRs that had been abbreviated. So I was ending all my paragraphs with a P tag, and I had no /Ps, right?
That's fantastic.
But it worked, right? Again,
yes,
it worked.
It did something.
Yes, I got something. And this is before CSS, so I wasn't styling it. I was literally just marking it up, and then the web browser showed it however it was going to show it. So, right, and just took it from there. Eventually, I discovered that, oh, okay, this paragraph thing is actually a container. I'm supposed to put things in it. Oh, how about that? Who knew?
What do you know?
Yeah.
So I do know we want to talk this episode. We want to talk more about CSS moving forward. I did want to bring up one other thing about CSS and some of the issues that I know, especially when I was learning CSS, that I had. You talked about it being very human readable. While that is technically true for things like padding and margins, some of the rules seem, from the outside, seem very arbitrary. For example, positioning, right? And the way that how position absolute relates to position relative. And I think my most visited web page is the CSS Tricks flexbox cheat sheet, because I can never remember any of that stuff. So some of it does seem like it's one of the things where this is so odd looking that there must be a good reason that it is this way. Because nobody would just do this just because.
That's mostly true.
Okay.
So some of the early stuff was just done just because. A lot of the very first CSS properties were modeled on stuff that Netscape did. So Float started because Netscape 1.1, when they introduced tables, also introduced floating of images. And so that's where the property name float comes from. Basically, it was, hey, let's replicate this, but we can take it and we can apply it to any element, not just images. But there are things that are essentially arbitrary. The box model, the fact that width refers to just the content in the default box model, was picked because the people who created the spec didn't want a situation where a property subsumed other properties. So if they had made width go from border edge to border edge, then that would have overlapped with the border width and padding values. So they said, okay, width will just be the content. All right, that makes sense to a computer scientist, and it might even make sense to a structuralist, but to people who are trying to make things look nice, which is what CSS is all about, it made very little sense, which is why we have the box sizing property now. So that people can say box sizing border box, and then when you say width, it's actually, this is the width from the part I can see on the left to the part I can see on the right. Cool.
That is literally my favorite thing that I've ever learned in CSS, was somebody told me that I could change box sizing to border box and have the width of the thing be the width I set. That saved me so much time.
Right. And so, I mean, those sorts of things tend to be arbitrary, but then CSS and actually most W3C specs have had an interesting flip. You mentioned earlier how the web platform is kind of following practice, and that's true, but it wasn't true to start because it couldn't be. There was no practice to follow. Right? When they were first writing CSS, presentation was all, if there was any presentation at all, it was all space for GIFs and tables. And so when they went to define things like being able to define the padding, they were kind of making it up as they went. I mean, not entirely. They drew on past work and layout, but they still had to just sort of make decisions and go with it. And CSS, HTML, other specs, but CSS certainly for a while was sort of this by fiat kind of thing, where the spec writers would try to guess what authors might want and then try to come up with a way to do it. And that led to some really bad missteps in some cases. Now there's still some of that, but not really. Things like variables following in the steps of preprocessors, or a capability that I believe is still in the color level 4 specification, is the ability to lighten or darken colors or shade colors. So I guess there's a in preprocessors there are modules, mix-ins, extensions, whatever you call them, where you can say, here's my red, and then in this case I want that same red, but I want it 40% darker or 30% lighter or whatever. Right? You can just modify it on the fly. So that capability now is being considered for the colors specification. It's in the level 4 draft, or it was. I don't know. I haven't looked super recently, but right, because someone wrote an extension in a preprocessor or a mix-in. I don't want to take sides here. And then that became popular, and the spec authors were able to then look at practice and say, how can we support this natively so people don't have to put it all in a preprocessor, and we can like offload it all to the hardware accelerator or whatever. That kind of thing is happening a lot more. It's more of an IETF model. The IETF is basically, what did industry do? Great, let's write it down. That's pretty much it. How they operate. The W3C used to be the other way around because they were inventing an entire field from scratch, but they've flipped, and I think it's a good thing.
I mean, it's actually really interesting because it's healthy in a sense. It doesn't have to be a competition, right, between using things that are native to the platform versus using custom solutions or third-party solutions. I mean, one can drive the other, and I think this kind of feedback loop, it's really healthy. It's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
Well, and we've got when we talk about sort of the way things are going, with Houdini sort of on the scope of CSS things. I mean, CSS really is sort of becoming a much larger sort of approach to a lot of different problems in terms of the way we render stuff on the web today. Like, you see a lot of movement around worklets and that sort of thing. Paint worklets, for instance, as well. Compositors, things like that. I mean, do you think that's driven out of the need for the performance across a wide range of devices, or do you think developers are looking for those sorts of things? Because I'm actually on the fence a little bit. Like, to me, like, it seems about 50-50. Like, we're talking about lower level things that allow me to build features into CSS that I may want. But is that because I have such a wide range of devices that I may need to do something better, or whatnot? What's your opinion of it?
Yeah. I'm a little bit uncertain, a little bit vague about what's driving that. I think performance is probably a lot of it, just because, browser makers, Google in particular, are super hyper about making things more performant, and I'm all for it. But yeah, my concern with Houdini is that I feel like there's going to be a temptation there for browser vendors mostly to just stop working on specs because they're like, we have Houdini now. People can write whatever they want. And that to me is a really bad idea. I like that people can experiment, but eventually there needs to be some sort of like codification, like the IETF does, right? Like the DVD spec, eventually they write down a DVD spec so that if your DVD player is compliant with the specification. And that's why you don't have to buy Sony DVDs for Sony players and Panasonic DVDs for Panasonic players. You just buy a DVD and you can play it whenever. On whatever, I mean. So, if people start writing things that become super popular that let you have 3D faces, then that ought to be codified at some point. And I worry that because we've been through it before, we went through a period where all the browser makers basically walked away from the CSS working group in effect. I mean, they stopped paying attention. They stopped thinking really about it. And there was that huge stagnant period. And I would hate to see that happen again, because since we got out of that stagnant period, there's been so much advancement and so many great features added. Things like flexbox and grid and gradients and compositing properties, mixing, color mixing and compositing properties, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, with things like Houdini sort of in the pipe, things like WebAssembly, where you may be able to add JavaScript features or drivers or anything that you really want on top of the platform. I love the flexibility of it. I love the low-level APIs personally, but I have a similar notion that I fear that you end up with a lot of divergence that doesn't become standardized across the board. I'm hoping that it allows vetting of things. That's my personal belief. Like, if I want to vet that this is a good idea for the platform, I don't necessarily need to even be a browser vendor to vet it, right? I can sit there and decide, okay, I'm going to use these toolings in my low-level stack to define this thing, and this looks like a good idea. Maybe I should take this, to one of the working groups or one of the incubators and go, hey, let's take a look at this. I've got some data that we can look at. I like that notion of it. I like the notion of being able to give users different experiences. But yeah, I mean, I like standards, which is to some extent it's the same thing with web components. I like to be able to build web components, but I don't think we should stop looking at what we should add to the the DOM in terms of HTML tags and things.
Yeah, and those sorts of technologies, I also worry about security. I worry about the attack surface suddenly becoming much larger.
I agree. Yeah.
So Erik, with that in mind, I'm curious to hear what you think of the state of CSS moving forward in 2018. Like, what's happening? I mean, so we kind of alluded on this extensible CSS movement with Houdini, but what else is going on? What else can we expect as developers?
I mean, what can we expect? To some degree, I have the same question you do. I wish I knew as well, because there's that whole sort of symbiotic process of the working group works on things, and then browsers implement things, but they don't necessarily it's not necessarily in lockstep. So it's not the working group says, "Boom, done. Everyone go implement and come back." That's just not how that works. It's great. We have a spec and everyone is now invited. Like, the W3C issues literal invitations to implement. They're not directives. That's not how the W3C works. It's, invited to implement CSS fragmentation, or whatever. And, sometimes that means that one browser has border rounding, border radius for 3 years, and another one doesn't. Or on the flip side, it can mean that 5 browsers ship grid in the space of 3 weeks, which happened earlier this year. And so, it's hard for me to say this is what's coming, because what's coming is dependent on a lot of moving parts. The one thing I feel confident in predicting is we're going to see a lot of discussion about grid. CSS Grid has, as I said, has launched this year, basically. And also Grid and Flexbox, because Flexbox has, I think, come up to production quality at about the same time. And also all the stuff that we used to lay out with, and how do those things relate, and what should we be using? And, anyone who's listening and thinking, oh my God, I have to learn a whole new layout system and throw out everything I ever knew, that's actually not true. It to some degree it's true, but it's not true the way you think it is. It's not like upgrading from major version of programming language to next major version of programming languages, and like old code will break because this method is no longer supported, or this built-in function is no longer supported. The web's not built that way either. Floats will still work. Your floated layouts will still be fine. Right? You don't have to go back and convert every layout you ever made for the last 15 years. And there will be cases where you still want to use float, but you don't you won't have to use it to like make columns anymore. The grid is here for that now, or flexbox, depending on what it is you're doing. And so all these pieces work together, right? They'll all be available. So rather than throwing out a toolbox and using a new toolbox, we're just adding more things to the toolbox, which I get it. The tyranny of choice is a real thing. And I get choice paralysis setting in, but I think that's what the next year is going to be about, is sorting through that choice paralysis. I think is going to hit a lot of people when they say, wait, do I grid? Do I flexbox? Do I float? What do I do? What do I do? Calm down. First of all, it's not that critical. Second of all, you have all these things and each of them does its own thing really well. Like floats were the hammer that we used on everything because it was what we had. And now we've got a hammer and a screwdriver and a I don't know what the third tool would be here. My analogy just broke down.
A nail?
Sorry.
Or you might have said that already.
Yeah. A hammer, a screwdriver, and a T-square. How's that? I don't know.
No, that's an interesting point. So I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the trends we've been seeing in the dev community. The first one being CSS and JS. Right? Mm-hmm. So I was a huge fan initially, then I'm slightly backtracking because of some performance benefits and caching issues. But this is a really huge thing. I mean, developers are like, yes, I now feel like God and I can do CSS all day. So can you kind of maybe shed some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So so I'm not a fan of CSS and JS for the most part. That's not a 100% blanket statement, but for the most part, because here's the basic reason is this. It's absolutely a square peg in a round hole kind of situation. It's hard for me to put into words sometimes, but you're basically taking a language that was designed one way and then trying to jam it into a language that was designed in a completely different way. Right. And I don't just mean like different syntax. I mean, different fundamental assumptions. And so CSS and JS, for the most part, is not CSS because it doesn't you're not cascading anything. And it's literally the first word in the name of the language. Right. You're applying everything directly in this in this little instance and not thinking about how that might propagate down the DOM tree. If there's someone out there who's using CSS and JS in a way that doesn't do that, I'm sorry. I can't speak for everyone, but this is what I have seen mostly is the cascade. I think is also part of what scares a lot of people. I apply this here and yet it has effects elsewhere and yikes. But without the cascade, CSS never would have taken off. It would have been the worst language ever. If I had to literally list the name of every single element I wanted to apply Georgia to for the font family, instead of just saying body, font family Georgia, I'm done here. Right? That totally makes sense. But that's not what a lot of CSS and JS systems do. And it's interesting. I was hearing... So there's a little bit of a grapevine that happens around this stuff. And I was hearing on the grapevine that the creator of one of the popular frameworks, and I don't know which one, so this isn't just me being anonymous for the sake of, preserving the guilt or innocence of people. It's just, I don't remember which one it was, but basically somebody who had made all of the CSS inline via JavaScript, I guess had recently realized why they shouldn't have done that in the first place. And that's, that's one of those conversations that seems to come up every now and again. Like we were talking about earlier, hey, I could just have all of my CSS be in style attributes in my markup. Okay, that's a bad idea, and here are the reasons why. Well, now we're doing it again, except in JavaScript. So not only are we doing a thing that CSS wasn't really built for, but we're doing it in an imperative layer where one little mistake makes the whole thing go away. So we lost both the flexibility of CSS and the robustness of CSS. I don't get it. I completely understand updating CSS through JavaScript, right? Okay, understood. But yeah, that's where I am, and I know that's not a popular opinion in a lot of quarters. But to me, trying to run all of your CSS through JavaScript is like trying to run all of your JavaScript through PHP. Like, regardless of what you think of PHP, why would you do that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a weird merge amongst things. I mean, the lines are blurred. That's the thing that sort of confused me, where I suppose maybe it's a misunderstanding. Like, so I've done code reviews, and I'm like, why did you approach it like this? And they're like, well, isn't it all one and the same? Because for some people, I kind of think to them it is all one and the same. They don't understand the dividing line because they've never actually seen the dividing line in the course of maybe what they've done. And to me, and I understand that, and maybe that's just a teaching moment of things. But yeah, I can't get behind with the concept.
And I think a little. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's just that I completely agree. I think that there's there's fundamentals around HTML, JavaScript, and CSS being processed differently in the browser that some people really just don't seem to grasp. So I think that's where Justin, your comment about some people saying isn't it all one and the same. I think that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, and to a large degree, people can get away with this now because JavaScript engines have become so incredibly powerful and so fast. I mean, the shift in performance from even a few years ago is just astounding. I mean, all kinds of credit to the teams that have put in that engineering work. But it's, they've made it so easy to do things that they've made it easy to do things badly and yet still pull it off, right? And so, the fact that you can now completely recreate Quake 3D in a browser, right? Like in 60 frames per second at real time, you're running a game. Also lets you do stuff that, 3, 4, 5 years ago, you would have ground the browser to a halt and no one ever would have done it for that reason. Now it's just like, I don't know, just throw the JavaScript engine at it. It can do whatever. So it's sort of like I remember Neil Stephenson in I believe it was in the beginning was the command line when he wrote about I think it was about grep maybe, or just plain the command line in general. He likened it to this professional power tool that he had used at some point when he was doing construction. He was like, this will do whatever you want, and it will also, if you aren't careful with it, it will do things you don't want, like take off limbs. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can really hurt yourself. And this isn't quite that. I don't want to liken this to limb loss, but it's a tool that's so powerful that you can force it into doing things that it just was not really designed for, and force other things into that environment. It's but again, you could write a PHP processor that was so powerful that you could build all of your JavaScript out of it. But again, why would you do that? Like, let things do the things they're good at.
So Erik, I guess we'll have time for one last question, which is, what are, being Erik Meyer, what are some of your funniest CSS historical backstories? I can imagine you have a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happened over the years. Funniest, the one that I remember is, and this is a really inside baseball, but CSS working group in 2000. We were talking about the clip property, which, for anyone out there who's thinking, wait, clip, what? Don't worry. You probably never used it, and you probably never will. But the idea was that you could clip in, but basically we had like a 3-hour conversation, and conversation is probably putting it a little mildly, about what clip was supposed to do, and there were like different implementations already in the wild, and they did different things, and how was it supposed to work, and what was the coordinate system supposed to be, and all this. And like at the end of it, the chair of the working group literally like stalked out of the room, effectively screaming. It was like, ah! And then we broke for lunch. And to me, part of what's funny about that is if you go back to the first edition of CSS, the Definitive Guide, I talk about the clip property. That is the only extant documentation of what we decided that day, because the meeting notes were lost for that morning. And so whatever I described in the Definitive Guide's first edition is what was decided about clip. But because that it was so, the landscape on that was so messed up, like the property never really went anywhere. And that, to me, it was sort of emblematic almost of we spent all this time trying to figure these things out, and then they die on the vine, unfortunately, sometimes. But that's how it goes. But over the years, I don't know about funny CSS stories. The only other one I can think of is the day that I was at an event apart Boston, and Ethan Marcotte was there as well. And I was when I was first trying to figure out web animations, when everything was still vendor prefixed. And I had done these basic animations, and then I had this one animation that just refused to run. It wouldn't do anything. And Ethan happened to be there, and I was like, Ethan, can you figure this out? Can you look at this? Can you tell me why this isn't working? He's looking at it. I'm looking at it. We're trying to figure it out. We're changing this, changing that value, like messing with this for 20 minutes. And then eventually I said, oh, it works now. It turns out that if you use a vendor prefix of WECBit instead of WebKit, it's not going to work. 20 minutes, and I had misspelled WebKit.
I feel most of I have similar stories where, like, this is not, this is obviously a platform bug, and they're going, oh, I forgot to spell things.
Yeah, and part of how I got started in CSS was kind of around that same kind of impulse, like literally back in 1996 when I first came across it. I saw it at the WWW5 conference, and I saw a presentation about it. It was saying this is in browsers now, and the specification will be finalized this fall. I was like, this is awesome. Right? Oh my God, I can change the size of text, and I can make it huge and blue and whatever I want to do with it. This is the greatest thing ever. So I got back to my office after the conference, and I immediately started doing things, and it immediately didn't work, or it didn't work all the time. And I kept thinking, God, what am I doing wrong? And eventually I started to realize, well, maybe it's not me. I was like Beverly Crusher in that episode of The Next Generation. If the problem isn't me, then the problem must be with the universe. Right. and so I started building test pages with like these simple test cases, right? Like H1 color red. Did that work? Great. Okay. H1 color blue. Did that also work? Cool. H1, color. And then I did a hex. Did that work? Awesome. And then I started to assemble them into a structure that mirrored the specification that said, okay, here's a test for padding, and here's a test for float, and here's a series of tests for this and then for that and the other thing. That's kind of how I got started, because I put those online for free. And then I started running browsers through them and saying, this browser supports this. It doesn't support this. It partially supports this. It supports it with bugs. And then I put those on the web for free. And that's how I got started, because people started coming to the page and saying, oh yeah, I tried to use this property. Now I see why nothing happened. Or I used this property and it didn't work, but you say it's supported. What's the deal? And that led to me writing articles for web review, for those who remember that, and most of you won't, but that's okay. And then web review shared cubicle space with O'Reilly, and at one day the O'Reilly people came across the hall effectively and said, we hear the CSS thing's kind of big, we might want to do a book on it. Do you guys here at web review know anybody who knows anything about CSS? And they said, we have a columnist. We should put you in touch with him. That's how I got to write my O'Reilly book, right? So but it's all came from that impulse of, right, like I feel certain I am doing this correctly, and yet it does not work. Like at first I thought it was my fault. Now I'm not so sure. Let me figure this out. And so it was just drilling down on that and just, figuring out, well, what am I doing wrong? What is the browser doing wrong? What does the browser just not understand? That really got me to where I am today. I mean, that was that turning point.
Yeah, I remember reading your stuff and your test cases. I remember coming across your stuff obviously a long time ago now.
Justin, how old are you?
I started in '96. Like that was my start point. I sold my first piece of software, which was web based, in '96.
That's incredible.
And I gotten into it at '95 or whatever, and by then I was making the rounds, doing that sort of stuff. But I was young at the time. I mean, it was the '90s.
Back when I was young.
Back when I was younger, my kids think it's hilarious because they're like, "Dad, you're so old." Like,
I get the same thing. I turn it around on them though, right? They're like, "Dad, you're so old." I was like, yes, I'm old. You kids don't know how good you have it. When I started out, we only had 8K of RAM, and we were grateful for it. You kids with your 128 gigabytes,
Exactly.
you don't know what storage is.
Yeah, no, that's what I tell my daughters. My daughters are like, they're sitting there and doing stuff, and I'm, it's to me it's fun. I mean, you got to laugh because it's just the way of things.
Thank you,
but
Eric.
thank you so much, Erik, for number one being on the show today and for all the work you have done over the course of many years.
Thank you both, and Danny too, who I think had to duck out. But thank you for having me. It's fun to reminisce sometimes.
It is. Please write a memoir. You have to write a memoir, Erik. There's so much I think you can share, with a lot of us youngins. So yes, I used the word youngins.
Yeah, youngins. And I'll leave you with this: the default indentation for block quotes and lists is 40 pixels because that's what Mosaic did. And it's still 40 pixels. It's not based on your font. It's 40 pixels because the Mosaic. Whoever did Mosaic just decided, 40 pixels looks right.
Oh, my God. Crazy.
God, I love the web. I just love it.
Right?
There's a story for everything when it comes to the web. It
really is.
Yeah. Well, and so, Erik, before we head out, where can people find you on the web? On Twitter, on your website?
So my website is meyerweb.com, MEYERWEB.com. That is, Meyerweb is also my Twitter handle, my Facebook handle. It's my handle on most social networks. It's I still blog occasionally, not like I used to, but I do still put stuff up there. And generally, if I've published something elsewhere, meyerweb.com is where it'll be. For those of you still kicking it RSS style, like myself, still got the RSS feed going. Woo!
I still like RSS. I still maintain them. I put them on everything. I refuse to let it die.
Yeah. Pretty much. If you go digging into YouTube channel pages, you can find an RSS feed for the YouTube channel. It's still there. It's just hard to find. Anyway.
Well, I think we're sidetracked into the way things should be now. Erik, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for putting up with me. I appreciate it.
And this has been indeed episode number 139 of the Web Platform Podcast. Join us next week when we discuss more things web with more wonderful people who are building cool things. We have been your hosts, Justin, Amal, and Danny. Leon says hello from the beach, and we will see you next week.